Hello guys, this is part 2 of our Hyper-V course. In part 2 we want to create now our first virtual machine. For this reason we go to our Hyper-V manager and say here new virtual machine. Then we click next and now we should set a name for this virtual machine. I would suggest for demo purposes we call the first virtual machine VM underscore corp server 1. Now you should check this checkbox, store the virtual machine in a different location. There is sometimes a bug in Hyper-V when you want to store the virtual machine with all its files, especially with a virtual hard drive, in one folder, so you could export that and back that directory to another hard drive back it up to another hard drive. Then it makes sense that everything is in one folder, and therefore you have to check this checkbox. You have to set this checkbox so everything will be in this folder. If you don't check it or uncheck it, there will be a bug sometimes that stores the VM configuration files in one folder and the virtual hard disk in a different folder. So we set this checkbox and say next. We have here generation 1 machine. If possible, I would suggest generation 2 machine, because this enables some features like secure boot, SSD boot, so you can use faster and bigger virtual hard drives. And you have to remember that this only works in Windows Server 2012 or Windows 8 in the 64-bit version and upper. So we use generation 2. Next, we set RAM memory size here, and we could set this to a minimum of 512 megabits. And we use dynamic memory. Dynamic memory enables you that the virtual machine, that the host operating system and Hyper-V dynamically assigns as much RAM as the virtual machine needs out of the 16 gigabytes that we have here. We set this checkbox, click next, and now we can set this network connection to the created Wi-Fi switch and say next. Now we create a virtual hard drive where your operating system will be stored, and I would suggest name it hard disk underscore VM and the name of the server. You could discuss about the size, what you need. I would suggest 1900 gigabyte, because if you set it up then more than 2 terabytes, then you could fail with older operating systems through the installation process, because some older operating systems, older than for example Windows 8, don't support hard drives where they can boot from larger than 2 terabytes. So I would say 2 terabytes minus 100 megabyte for these purposes here. So we click next, and before we click next we see that Hyper-V creates a specific folder that is called how our virtual machine is called, and this under this folder tree here. We click next. We say install an operating system later. Here you can set the installation media, but we will set this later on. Say next. Here you see your details of the virtual machine and click finish. Now you can right click this machine and say settings, and here you can add, for example, specific hardware. You can select the boot order, you can enable secure boot, you can give the virtual machine a startup RAM, which should be at least 512 megabit. And here you can set dynamic memory, for example, from 512 to 4096. And between this range, the virtual machine gets as much RAM as it needs. So if you have more than one virtual machine, it makes much sense to use dynamic memory, because then every virtual machine instance gets as much memory as it needs. And for example, if you have a mail server which needs at night more RAM for backup purposes, then it gets more RAM, and during the day it gets less RAM if there is no need for it. You can set the memory buffer, where Hyper-V tries to reserve some memory. You can specify the memory weight between this virtual machine and the other virtual instances on this server, but we don't want to change anything here. Next we go to processor and set this to the maximum here, because if we have 8 virtual processors, we want to use it. Here you can make some resource control, how much percentage every VM can get of the memory of the processor and that stuff. We don't need these special settings. Then you have here your SSD controller, where you can set your hard drive. This is the hard drive that we created before. We have here some advanced features that we don't need now. Then we have here the network adapter, where we connect this network adapter to the Wi-Fi switch. We could tag here VLAN informations, bandwidth management. We go next to hardware acceleration. These are special features that we don't need now. Here, if possible, you can use the single root I/O virtualization mentioned before. This enables you to use faster network connection without going over too much network layers through the operating system, but you have to use specific drivers sometimes for that. Advanced features, you can create a static MAC address here for this PC or this VM instance. I don't recommend this now. Also the other features, let them how they are. Say apply for first time. Then here you can change the name of the VM. Here are the integration services. These are features that provides Hyper-V to the virtual machines. For example, a soft operating system shutdown, a time synchronization between your host and guest machines, data exchange through clipboard, for example, heartbeat, which stands for something like check if the virtual machine is on or not, a backup system, and guest services. For testing purposes, you set all these things to on. If you have an Active Directory, for example, and you get your time from another server, you would change this off for every virtual machine. But now for the first time we set this on. Here you see where specific checkpoints will be saved. We'll come to this later. Smart paging files. Automatic start action means what will happen if the host machine gets a reboot. Should the VMs boot automatically? Should they start automatically with the host operating system? Should there happen nothing? Should they automatically start if the VM was running when you shut the system down? Or should they always start automatically? Let this here where it is. You can set a startup delay, for example. You can say your domain controller should be started first, and 2 minutes later the second domain controller or the backup server should boot. And the automatic stop action says what happens if your host machine, what happens if you shut down your host machine. Then you can say save the virtual machine state, which is something like the hibernate mode. Turn the virtual machine off. I don't think you should do this because this is something like plug the power cable off. I would recommend to shut the guest operating system down. To save the virtual machine state could be a mess in a production environment, because then the virtual machines or the virtual servers get saved or hibernated, if you want to call it so, and if you wake them up again or if you start them again, they will lose the time, and there is a time gap between, and then some or many server features and server roles get into real problems. So don't use this in production environment. Now we have set here everything. We could click OK, and we could start our virtual machine. We do right click here and say connect. Here you see that this virtual machine is turned off, and here we could turn this thing on. You see that nothing happens. Why? Because there is no operating system installed. So what we do is we turn it off, and we go to settings and go to SSD Controller, DVD drive, add. We add here now a virtual DVD drive and select an ISO file with our installation data. We go to Data E, ISO, and select Server 2012. Apply. Maybe you want to change the boot order here. You say the DVD drive should be the first thing where you boot from, and the network adapter the last one. Say apply, OK. Right click, connect. For specific reasons we will disconnect our network here and say OK. Now we start the virtual computer. We have to press any key to say that it should boot from the DVD drive. So as you see here now, you see the display of the virtual machine. I say here German Austria because I live in Austria. Next. Okay. Install now. So now we continue here with the selection what we want to install here. We have standard server data center, which enables more or less features, and core server means server in operating system without a graphical user interface, but we want a graphical user interface, so we go to data center with a GUI and say next. We accept the license. We say custom install. Here we have our hard disk, drive 0 with the unallocated space. We click next, and it automatically creates an anti-fs partition and makes a quick format. Now in the meantime, I show you some troubleshooting things, because sometimes the operating system gets some errors if you want to install a new virtual machine. Then you go to the VM settings, and the first thing that I would recommend is to turn off the secure boot. Secure boot prevents operating systems without a digital signature, like in e-banking applications and this stuff, from installing. So older Linux versions and older Windows versions won't be able to install. This is the first thing. And then the next thing is set the startup RAM and the minimum RAM to 1024 megabytes. Some operating systems and also Windows operating systems won't install in Hyper-V if you only have 512 megabyte. I have stopped the video before and changed this setting and deactivated the secure boot because the installation process here gets a nasty error. Now you see that Windows needs to reboot. Then you can click Media, DVD drive, and eject this ISO file from the DVD drive. And now the process is the same if you install a physical computer. Now the installation is finished and you have to set a password. On a server operating system, you have a password complexity requirement that says you have to use a complex password. For example, on this demo installation, we use password 1, and I think this is called exclamation mark. The password will be written down in the video description. So we say finish, and then we can log in here. You have to press Control, Alt and Delete. Here is a button where you only have to press it, and then you enter your password. So now we have created our first virtual server, which is not connected to the internet or to any sort of Ethernet connection now. This will come in our next video. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.